My mother threw me out to hand my room to the nanny just to make it painfully clear which daughter she never regretted having. Sound of a soft, lingering chord, then fades to silence. Can you imagine being told you ruined someone's life before you even took your first breath? I didn't have to imagine it. That was my origin story, delivered with a casual laugh that still chills me to the bone. My mother would say it, almost as a joke, to anyone who'd listen, and everyone would chuckle, thinking she was just being dramatic. But I knew. Oh, I knew she meant every word. When I was a kid, I didn't get the whole picture, not really. But I understood enough to know I wasn't part of any grand plan. The details, they came later. Bits and pieces, usually when adults forgot I was in the room, or when someone, desperate to win an argument, threw the past like a weapon. My mother was 20, finally free, deep into college, casually dating my father. Then, suddenly, she was pregnant. With me. She wanted to end the pregnancy. But my father? He never met a boundary, he didn't stomp right through. He got excited, blabbed to his parents, then to hers, before she even had a chance to breathe, to think, to decide. And after that, there was no going back for anyone. My grandparents, on my mother's side, they were religious. Not the kind who cared about people, but the kind who cared about appearances. When my father blurted out the news at a family dinner, my grandmother didn't think about my mother's future or her health. She thought about the church, about the gossip. My grandfather, his voice cold, told my mother that if she even considered ending the pregnancy, she'd be cut off. Completely. No tuition. No rent. No family. My parents had one epic fight, broke up before my next ultrasound, and never got back together. My grandparents then paraded around, telling everyone they were standing by their daughter through a difficult time. What that really meant was forcing her to carry a baby she didn't want, while controlling every single decision and calling it love. I can still see it. One afternoon, when I was maybe 8. It plays in my head like a grainy, bad video. My mother had one of her church friends over, the kind who smelled of strong perfume and carried a Bible that was clearly just a prop. I was supposed to be in my room doing homework. But our walls were paper thin, and my door never quite closed. So I heard everything, the rise and fall of their voices. Even when I pretended I wasn't listening. My mother poured coffee into the good cups, the ones only used for company, and started telling the story. Her story. The one she always told when she wanted sympathy. The one where I was the tragic plot twist that ruined her life. She talked about being so close to finishing school, about her plans, how she'd been naive enough to trust my father. Then she lowered her voice, conspiratorial, and said, I didn't even get a choice. They backed me into a corner, and now I'm paying for it every single day. A pause. Then her friend, softly, do you ever regret it? Meaning me, of course. My mother sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound. I try not to think about it, she said. But some days are harder than others. I remember sitting there, pencil in hand, staring at a math problem that suddenly meant absolutely nothing. My ears burned. Like I had done something wrong just by existing in the next room. She knew I was home. She knew I could hear her. And she still framed me as a punishment, right there in her own living room. When her friend left that night, my mother knocked on my door. Didn't wait for an answer. Just came in. Finished your homework? She asked. I nodded. Good, she said, her voice flat. At least you're useful for something. Then she turned off my light and walked out, like she hadn't just spent an hour explaining how my entire life was an inconvenience she'd never wanted. That was the first time I understood. In a way I couldn't yet articulate. That whatever softness other mothers had for their kids, mine kept locked away. Somewhere I was never, ever going to reach. By the time I was born, that relationship was already dead and cold. My father still showed up at the hospital with flowers and a stuffed animal, trying to play the excited new dad. But my mother just looked at him like he was another thing she had to survive. My grandmother always bragged about being the first to hold me because my mother was exhausted and not in a good headspace. Her polite way of saying my mother wouldn't even look at me for hours. When she finally did, according to my grandmother, she sighed and said, well, there goes my life. As if I was a broken-down car, not a newborn. My grandparents set up the system that would define my whole childhood. They paid my school tuition directly, not through my mother, so she couldn't mismanage the money. They sent a fixed amount each month for my food and clothes. And my mother had to send them receipts, proof it was all for me. They loved being saviors. My mother got to keep a roof over her head, as long as she cooperated. And I became the project. The leverage they used to keep her in line. On Sundays, we'd sit in the same church pew like a picture from a brochure. My grandmother, stiff in her pressed dress. My grandfather, Bible clutched tight. My mother, with her carefully neutral face. And me, in whatever outfit my grandmother had picked out. Inside our apartment, it was a different story. My mother didn't touch me unless she had to. She took care of me in the technical sense. I was fed, clothed, went to school, had a bed. But there was no softness. No warmth. She'd say things like, if your father had kept his mouth shut, I would have finished college. Or, if I'd been allowed to make my own decision, you wouldn't even be here. She didn't scream these things in a fight. She said them while making dinner, while folding laundry, while scrolling through her phone on the couch. Just casual facts about how my existence had ruined her path. From the outside, we looked fine. Not rich, but stable. My grandparents loved talking about their sacrifice. My mother acted like a proud parent in public. I remember bringing home my first big achievement, first place in some school competition. I walked into the kitchen, certificate in hand, like it was a golden ticket. Look what I got, I said, holding it up. I won. She glanced at it, nodded. That's the minimum with the school you go to. Then went back to rinsing dishes. The next Sunday at church? She told 5 different people how proud she was, how hard I worked, how she always knew I was smart. She smiled so wide it hurt to look at. On the drive home, she didn't mention it once. My father was like background noise through those years. He'd always struggled with substances, a nice way of saying the man couldn't keep his life together for more than a few months. When I was little, he showed up maybe once a month. Usually late. Smelling of stale smoke and something I couldn't name back then. He'd bring random toys or fast food, tell stories about when he and my mother were young and wild, then leave again. My mother let him in because it looked good. She complained nonstop after he left, but she liked telling people she didn't keep me from my father. That made her sound generous. Around 10, I started asking to stay with him on weekends. I wish I could say I had a profound reason, but the truth is, I was just desperate for any version of a parent who might actually want me around. My mother seemed relieved, more than anything. Fewer days with me meant fewer reminders of the life she thought she should have had. My grandparents didn't love the idea, but they didn't fight it either. Probably tired of being the only ones who had to appear noble. That first weekend at my father's apartment burned itself into my brain. The place was small. Dim, it smelled like smoke and something sharp that made my throat itch. Blankets blocked most of the sunlight. Dishes piled in the sink. Takeout containers on the coffee table. The bedroom? A mattress on the floor, no frame, and a random collection of clothes in a corner, pretending to be a closet. He tried to act normal. Pointed at the TV, asked what I wanted to watch. Offered snacks. Talked about some band he liked. I sat there, trying to ignore the feeling that the whole place might collapse if I touched anything too hard. What made it worse was how I kept trying to convince myself it was normal. When the sink backed up with cloudy, old food-smelling water, I told myself, lots of people have plumbing problems. When I opened the fridge and saw half a soda, expired eggs, and a single, dried sauce container, I thought, we just haven't gone grocery shopping yet. I lined up my little travel-sized shampoo bottles on the edge of the grimy bathtub, like that made the bathroom mine, and not just a place he occasionally remembered to shave. He put a thin blanket and a flat pillow on the couch and joked that it was like camping. And I laughed. Because I could tell he needed me to. Even though my back hurt halfway through the night, and every street sound made me think someone was trying to break in. At one point Saturday night, the power flickered. The room went dark for a second. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. My father, half watching TV, half asleep, didn't even look up. Just muttered something about the building being old. I sat there, hands clenched, thinking about my mother's house. The solid furniture, the working locks, the full pantry. And I realized I was more afraid of her sharp words than I was of sitting in that dim, dangerous little room. That messed me up more than anything. A kid shouldn't be doing pros and cons in her head about which parent feels less dangerous. The next morning, he tried to make it better. The only way he knew how. He woke up before me, which almost never happened, and went out to get breakfast. I woke up alone on the couch, sunlight in my face, panic crawling up my spine, thinking he'd disappeared again. 10 minutes later, the door opened. He came in, carrying a greasy paper bag and 2 drinks. The cheapest breakfast sandwiches he could find. An orange juice he clearly couldn't afford. He said they had a 2-for-1 deal, like that explained it. I pretended to believe him. We ate sitting on the floor because the little table was covered in unpaid bills and junk. He kept asking if I liked it, even though it was barely warm. That meal was awful and perfect at the same time. It tasted like salt and cold bread. It tasted like someone trying, really trying, even if they were already failing in 10 other ways I couldn't ignore. One afternoon that weekend, he said he was running out to grab something and would be right back. Hours passed. I sat there, watching reruns, listening to the neighbors stomp upstairs, checking the door every time I heard footsteps. He came back late at night, talking too fast. Jittery. Pupils blown. The next morning, I went to heat leftovers. The microwave was gone. When I asked, he said it broke. He threw it out. Later, I heard him on the phone, telling someone he'd sold it for quick cash. That was the first time it really clicked. That just existing in his space, needing food, attention, basic supervision, was an actual problem he couldn't afford. Back home, nothing softened towards me because my father was a mess. If anything, it gave my mother new ammo. Anytime I brought up something I wanted, even something small, she'd sigh and say, "Do you want to end up like him?" Always begging for help, always depending on other people. She reminded me, regularly, that my grandparents were paying for my school, for my clothes, for any chance I had at a normal life. And that one wrong move could make all of that vanish. I learned to keep my needs small and hidden. I learned to say thank you for things nobody should have to beg for. In my mid-teens, my mother started dating someone. Decent job. Family my grandparents approved of. Button-down shirts. Even on weekends. He was polite to me, in that distant way where you could tell he hadn't signed up for a package that included a teenage daughter. He called me kid, asked about school, but he never really looked at me when he said it. My mother, though? She lit up around him. She laughed differently. Cooked more elaborate meals. Cleaned our already clean apartment twice as much. It was like she finally saw a version of her life that didn't revolve around me, and she wanted it badly. They got married when I was 17. Small, tasteful, suffocating. My grandparents sat in the front row, acting like they'd orchestrated the whole thing. Speeches about second chances and new beginnings. People told my mother she deserved happiness, and they meant it. Nobody asked what I deserved. I wore a dress my grandmother picked, stood in some photos, smiled on cue, and counted the minutes until I could take off my shoes. About 2 years after the wedding, my mother told me she was pregnant again. Not at the beginning, either. She was already a few months along when she dropped it over dinner, between bites, like she was mentioning a new show. Her husband sat there with this proud, nervous smile while she said they had good news. When she said there was going to be a baby, I just nodded. My stomach twisted a little, but not from jealousy. It felt more like watching someone start a brand new book while you were still stuck in the middle of one you never wanted to read in the first place. Around that time, the real war with my grandparents started. They had strong opinions about how my mother should raise this new child, just like they'd tried to direct everything when she had me. The difference now? My mother had a husband. And a sense of herself she hadn't had when she was 20. She pushed back. Told them she'd raise her baby the way she wanted. They did not take that well. The fights were loud. Dramatic. Accusations about respect and sacrifice. Lectures about sin and duty. Finally, my grandparents did what they had been threatening my whole life. They cut her off. Cutting her off meant cutting me off too, because all the money they sent every month was technically for the child. And that child had always been me. They stopped paying the school, stopped the monthly transfer for my clothes and food. They told my mother that if she wanted to make her own decisions, she could pay her own bills. They didn't call me separately to explain or comfort me. In their minds, I was leverage, not a person. One week, I was the evidence of their moral superiority. The next, I was just another line item in a budget they were done covering. By my 19th birthday, my mother was deep into that pregnancy with my baby sister. We had a small birthday dinner at home. No extra money for anything beyond basic bills and baby stuff. Her husband kept saying the big break is coming. They were already floating things on credit and pretending it wasn't panic. Her husband grilled in the yard. My mother complained about her back. And I cut my own cake. I remember blowing out the candles and thinking, maybe when this baby comes, things will be different. Maybe having a second chance will soften her. Maybe I'll matter in some new way. Looking back now, I can see how desperate that hope was. But at the time, it felt like the only thing keeping me from packing a bag and disappearing. My sister arrived a week later. Small, loud, completely innocent in a situation that was already toxic. The whole apartment shifted around her. My mother was suddenly affectionate, obsessed, glowing in a way I'd never seen. She took pictures constantly, talked to the baby in soft voices I would have sold my soul to hear when I was little. I helped, because I didn't know what else to do. I changed diapers, warmed bottles, walked the baby at 3 in the morning so my mother could sleep for an hour. I thought maybe this was the way in. The way to finally be part of a family instead of orbiting the edges. 2 weeks after the baby came home, my mother and her husband sat me down in the living room for a serious talk. I should have known nothing good ever starts with, "We need to talk." But I was tired, and hopeful, and stupid. They waited until after dinner, when the dishes were done, and the baby was finally sleeping. My mother sat on the edge of the armchair, hands on her knees. Her husband next to her. I sat on the couch opposite them, already feeling like I was on trial without knowing the charges. My mother started with, "You know we love you," which hit my ears like a warning siren. Then she said they'd signed up for an au pair program. A living nanny from another country. She said it like it was some smart solution, cheaper than daycare, like paperwork could magically turn debt into stability. The nanny would help with the baby so my mother and her husband could focus on his business, which was just about to become the next big thing. It hit me later that they'd started the process before my grandparents cut them off. And once the fees were paid, the promises made, they were too proud to back out, even if it meant sacrificing me. Our place had 3 bedrooms. They had the main. The baby had the small room that used to be the guest room. I had the last one. Her husband leaned forward. "You're an adult now. You're working. You're capable. And we think it's time for you to start your own life." It took a second for my brain to connect the dots. And when it did, I felt physically cold. "Where do you expect me to go?" I asked. My mother shrugged, like we were discussing where to put a piece of furniture. "You can rent a room somewhere. That's what adults do." When I brought up college, how I'd put it off because there was no money and she'd promised we'd figure it out, she laughed. Not kindly. She laughed the way you laugh at a bad joke. "I have done my time," she said. "I carried you. I raised you. I fed you. If it had been up to me, you wouldn't even be here, remember? I finally have the child I chose, and I am not going to sacrifice her future because you're too scared to grow up." Her husband didn't say a word in my defense. He didn't propose alternatives. He just sat there, nodding occasionally, eyes drifting towards the television like he had somewhere better to be. The only time he spoke directly to me was to remind me, in this mild voice, to leave my house key on the kitchen counter. When I left, it was like I was giving up a rental, not leaving the only home I'd ever known. I wish I could tell you I stayed calm, handled it gracefully. I didn't. I cracked wide open. I told my mother she was cruel, that she had never wanted me, that she was proving it again. I told her that one day my sister would grow up and see exactly who she really was. I said ugly things I'd been holding in for years. She rolled her eyes, told me not to be dramatic, that I wasn't the victim here, that people moved out at my age all the time. She made it sound like I was throwing a tantrum over rent instead of being discarded to make space for a stranger. I packed while I was still shaking. Grabbed clothes, my small stack of books, a few personal things I couldn't imagine leaving behind. I stood in my doorway for a second, looking at that room that had never really felt like mine, but was the only thing standing between me and homelessness. Then I shut off the light and walked out. Nobody followed me. Nobody asked where I was going. The baby cried in the nursery as I closed the front door. I left my key on the counter like I was supposed to. The only place I could go was my father's apartment. It was either that or a shelter. And as bad as things were with him, sleeping on his couch still felt safer than the unknown. I took a bus across town, holding my bag so tight my fingers went numb. When he opened the door, he looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. Bloodshot eyes. Shaking hands. That restless energy that comes right before another bad decision. He blinked at me, like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Then he smiled, that lopsided smile, and said, "Hey, kid." Like I just stopped by for a casual visit. The mix of anger and relief that hit me in that moment was almost nauseating. I walked past him into the apartment, which somehow looked even more chaotic than before. Empty cans. Clothes on the floor. Something spilled and dried on the coffee table. He asked what was going on. I started talking before I could lose my nerve. I told him I had nowhere else to go. I told him I was staying. I told him he needed to get his act together because I couldn't build a life on quicksand anymore. He chuckled at first, reached for the cigarette in his hand. That sound just snapped something in me. I grabbed the cigarette, walked to the sink, put it out under the faucet. When he reached for the pack for another one, I slapped his hand. Hard. The sound shocked both of us. I had never hit anyone in my life, and there I was, slapping my own father in his living room like he was a misbehaving toddler. His face darkened with embarrassment and anger. He muttered a curse, stumbled into the bedroom, and slammed the door in my face. I spent that first night on the couch, fully dressed, shoes still on, staring at the ceiling. There was a crack near the light fixture that looked like a crooked line, and I followed it with my eyes over and over until they burned. My bag sat on the floor next to me, a constant reminder that this was it. This was home now. I could hear my father moving around in the bedroom, pacing, muttering, flushing the toilet, opening and closing drawers. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of the bedroom door opening and the smell of coffee. He looked more human the next morning. Still tired. Still older than he should have looked. But calmer. He sat on the edge of the armchair and asked if I'd really meant it when I said I was staying. I told him everything that had happened at my mother's place. Every word. Every shrug. Every casual rejection. His jaw tightened. His eyes got shiny in a way I'd never seen. He grabbed his phone and tried calling my mother. She didn't answer. He tried calling my grandparents. My grandmother picked up long enough to say, "This is not our problem anymore," before hanging up. That was the moment it became real. There was no safety net left. No grandparents waiting in the wings. No mother who would calm down and call back. Just me. My father. And an apartment that smelled like stale smoke and failed promises. We made a plan that morning, because that's what people do when everything is falling apart and they need to feel like they have any control. It was simple. I'd keep working my boring job. He'd get sober, for real this time, and find a steady job. We'd split the bills. We'd keep a roof over our heads by any means we could manage. Reality, of course, didn't care about our plan. The next months were some of the hardest of my life. My father tried. I'll give him that. He went to a few support group meetings because I pushed him. He applied for jobs, printed resumes, went to interviews. Sometimes he came back hopeful. Sometimes he came back crushed. And sometimes he didn't come back at all until late at night, eyes glassy, smelling like every bad decision he'd ever made. We got our power shut off once because he used the bill money for something else. We got a notice on the door threatening eviction. I started sleeping with my wallet under my pillow after I woke up to find him standing over my bag, fingers already on the envelope with the rent money. The night I caught him like that, hunched over my backpack, was one of those moments that split your life into before and after. I'd just come out of the shower, hair wrapped in a towel, thinking about whether I could make noodles without using too much water because the bill was already late. He was crouched on the floor by the couch, my bag tipped over, wallet open, fingers already on the envelope with the rent money I'd pulled out earlier that day. For a second, he froze, like a kid caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Then he straightened up, too fast, almost lost his balance. He started babbling about just wanting to make sure I'd put it somewhere safe, that he was checking, that he was helping. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy, and he couldn't quite look directly at me. I could smell the sharp chemical edge of whatever he had taken hours before. My heart dropped into my stomach in that sick, heavy way. I didn't scream. I just stepped forward, took the envelope out of his hand, and said, "Don't do this to me. Not this. Not you." He tried to laugh it off. Said I was overreacting. Said he'd pay me back when his next check came in, like that had ever happened. I felt something inside me harden in a way that scared me almost as much as what he was doing. 2 days later, the power company finally followed through. The bright orange notice they'd slapped on our door became reality. The lights went out in the middle of the evening. The television clicked off. The cheap fan that moved warm air around our living room stopped with a little dying sound. My father wasn't home. I sat on the couch in the dark for a solid 10 minutes, listening to the hum of other people's air conditioners through the walls, before I got up and lit the one candle I'd been saving for emergencies. I charged my phone at work the next day and pretended I thought the outage was temporary whenever anyone asked. At home, I showered in cold water and used the flashlight on my phone to find clothes in the dresser. I hid the rent envelope inside a shoe in the back of my closet because I didn't trust him not to go hunting for it again. That was the week I stopped thinking of myself as a daughter who happened to be helping and started accepting that I was the adult keeping both of us barely above water. I got used to performing normal. At work, I smiled, answered phones, sorted invoices, made small talk in the break room. One afternoon, a coworker looked at me for a long moment and said, "You look like you haven't slept in a week. Do you have kids or something?" I laughed it off. "No, just family stuff." She shook her head. "You have that vibe. Like you come from one of those families where there's always some mess happening." She meant it as a joke, but it landed like a diagnosis. Eventually, my father did land a job. He got hired as a supervisor at a distribution center, the kind of place where the work is hard and the pay is average, but they don't dig too deep into your past as long as you show up on time. Around the same time, my boss offered me a promotion to a slightly better position handling accounts. The raise wasn't huge, but when you're counting every dollar, even a little bit feels like moving a mountain. For the first time, we could pay rent and utilities more or less on time. Groceries weren't just cheap noodles and canned soup. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't survival mode every second of the day. Stability didn't magically cure anything between us, but it changed the temperature in the apartment. My father still had cravings. He slipped up sometimes. I still hid my cash in weird places. But he also started taking recovery more seriously. He went to meetings without me nagging. He talked to other people who understood what it meant to destroy your own life and then try to rebuild it. We started having real conversations that weren't just about bills or disaster control. He'd tell me little stories from work, stupid jokes his coworkers made, annoying customers. One time he came home laughing because a customer had tried to return a hammer after using it to build an entire deck, claiming it was defective. We started betting on which coworker would call in sick on Mondays. I told him about the client who typed every email in Comic Sans and signed off with Bible verses that had nothing to do with office supplies. We started leaving each other ridiculous notes on the fridge, competing to see who could make the other laugh first. It wasn't therapy, but it was something lighter than survival mode. We became something like roommates with history, who were figuring out we actually liked each other. Then, out of nowhere, an old friend from childhood, C, reached out on social media. We'd been close in middle school before her family moved away. We swapped updates, surface level at first, then she asked how things were really going. I told her a version that was honest, but not graphic. She told me her father was expanding his office supply business and planning to open a location in my city. They needed someone to handle administrative work, someone organized and stubborn enough to keep things running while everything got off the ground. She thought that sounded like me. My first instinct was to say no. It felt like charity. Like she pitied me. I don't want a handout, I told her. She replied almost immediately, "This isn't a handout. This is me offering you a job because I know you show up." She reminded me of all the times I'd helped her with school projects, how I'd always been the one keeping track of deadlines for group work. She said, "I trust you more than I trust a stranger off the street. Let me put in a word. You still have to show up and do the work." I took a deep breath and said, "Yes." The interview was more of a conversation than a formal thing. Her father asked about my experience, why I wanted to leave my current job, what I was looking for. I didn't give him the full memoir, but I didn't sugarcoat my situation either. Somehow, that honesty didn't scare him off. He offered me the job. The pay was better. There was room to grow. He even asked, almost as an afterthought, if I knew anyone reliable who could handle warehouse work, because they'd need that too. I thought of my father, hesitated, then said his name. My father nearly panicked when I told him. He asked if I was sure. He worried they'd find out about his past and regret it. I told him this was his chance to prove he wasn't just the sum of his worst days. He went through the interview process, told the truth when they asked about gaps in his work history, and somehow, they hired him. The pay was a little better than what he was making at the distribution center, and the schedule was more stable. We both gave notice at our old jobs, held our breath, and stepped into something new. We moved into a slightly nicer apartment, in a safer neighborhood, closer to the new jobs. For the first time, I had a bedroom that didn't feel temporary. I painted the walls a color I liked, bought a thrift store dresser and a secondhand desk. I cried the night everything was put together, because it was the first space in my life that felt like it belonged to me. And only me. We bought matching plates. Real ones, not chipped hand-me-downs. We had a little balcony where I could drink coffee on weekend mornings. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The first night in that new apartment didn't feel like one of those fresh start moments people post about on social media. It felt awkward, echoey. The walls were bare. The carpet smelled vaguely like the last tenant's cooking, and our furniture looked too small and too tired for the space. We ate fast food on top of a cardboard box because the actual table was still in pieces. And my father kept opening and closing cabinets like he couldn't quite believe we had more than one. After we finished eating, he held up one of the plastic cups and said, "We'll get real glasses when your first paycheck hits." Like it was some big, fancy plan. And I laughed harder than the joke deserved, because it was the first time in a long time that the future didn't feel like a black hole. Later, when he went to bed, I sat on the floor in my half-unpacked room with a pile of old photos spread out around me. Pictures of me as a baby that my grandparents had insisted on printing. School portraits where my smile looked just a little too forced. A blurry shot of my father holding me at some park when I was small enough to fit on his hip. I taped a few of them to the wall with the cheap sticky putty we'd picked up at the dollar store. Not because they were beautiful, or because they made me feel good, but because I needed proof that my life had actually happened. That I had been a kid once, and not just this permanent inconvenience moving from one tense living room to another. Outside, I could hear cars passing and someone laughing on the sidewalk. And for the first time in years, I realized that nobody in this building knew anything about us. There was a strange kind of safety in that. In being anonymous and boring. In a place where the neighbors didn't greet you with, "So, how's your mother holding up?" I fell asleep that night with the window cracked open, the air smelling like rain and exhaust, listening to my father snore down the hall, and thinking, this isn't much, but it's ours. No one was going to tell me to keep my shoes out of the entryway because guests might see them. No one was going to remind me that the electricity or the rent or the food on the table existed because of someone else's generosity. If the lights stayed on, it would be because we paid for them. If they went off, it would be because we messed up, not because someone decided to teach us a lesson. It was terrifying and freeing at the same time. Like standing at the edge of a pool and realizing that if you jump, there's nobody coming in after you, but you want to feel the water anyway. My friend, C, who got me the job, checked in regularly those first few months. She'd text, asking how I was settling in, if her dad was being weird, if I needed help with the apartment. When I tried to thank her for the 100th time, she just shut me down. You would have done the same for me, she said. And we both knew that was true. She became one of those rare people who shows up when it matters and doesn't keep score. On my birthday that year, she took me out for cheap wine and expensive dessert. And when I started to cry halfway through explaining why the day felt so complicated, she just pushed the whole dessert plate toward me and said, "Eat your feelings. I'll order another one." One Saturday morning, about a month after we moved in, I woke up to the smell of actual breakfast being cooked. Not cereal. Not toast. My father was in the kitchen, making scrambled eggs and humming something off-key. When I walked in, he looked almost embarrassed. Said he was practicing for when he had to host his sponsor from the meetings. But there were 2 plates. He slid one toward me without making a big deal out of it. We ate breakfast together in our small kitchen, morning light coming through the window. And for maybe 5 minutes, I felt what normal families probably feel every single day without even noticing. It wasn't fireworks. It was just breakfast. But I had to leave the table before I finished eating because my eyes started burning, and I didn't want to cry over scrambled eggs. I wish I could say I hugged him or said something profound, but all I managed was a shaky joke about not burning the toast. And somehow, that felt like enough for that morning. Years went by. Not a lifetime, but enough time that the rawness of those earlier years started to scab over. I did well at work. My boss trusted me. I got small raises and more responsibility. My father stayed with the job. Showed up. Got a reputation as the guy who would cover a shift if someone else called out. He kept going to meetings. He still had hard days, and so did I. But the disasters got fewer and further between. We lived like regular people, complaining about traffic and laundry instead of figuring out which bill to let slide and hoping we wouldn't get evicted. Through all of that, my relationship with my mother and her side of the family stayed exactly the same. Non-existent. No calls. No texts. No birthday cards that got lost in the mail. If I wanted to, I could have convinced myself they had all just evaporated. I heard little updates occasionally, through people who didn't realize they were stepping on a landmine when they mentioned them. My sister was growing up. My grandparents were getting older. My mother's husband's business wasn't the miracle they'd promised, but apparently they were still pretending everything was fine. Then, one random weekday afternoon, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to pick up. I said, "Hello." There was a pause. Then I heard my mother's voice. For the first time in years. It's ridiculous how a voice can drag you right back into being a scared kid again. My hands started shaking. I didn't say anything at first. She said my name quietly, like she wasn't sure I would stay on the line. She didn't start with, "I'm sorry." Of course she didn't. She started with, "I know it's been a while, but we're in trouble." She told me she'd left her stable job a few years earlier to help her husband with a new venture. They had taken out loans, put expenses on credit cards, poured everything into it. It had failed. Slowly, then all at once. They were behind on payments. They had already sold the house, the nicer car, jewelry, anything that could bring in quick money. They were living in a small rental and still drowning. She said she'd heard from some relatives that I was doing well, that I had a good job, that I lived in a nice place. And she sounded half impressed, half offended when she said it. Then she got to the point. She said she needed my help. Not advice. Not emotional support. Money. She told me there were specific debts with deadlines looming, and if they didn't pay, they risked losing their home. She mentioned my sister. Said she was old enough now to understand what was going on. Said she was terrified. She doesn't deserve this, she said. And I could feel the hook in those words. Of course, my sister didn't deserve any of it. The question was whether I was supposed to be the answer. I told her I needed time to think. She agreed, but she sounded more relieved than emotional, like she'd just secured a loan extension. Over the next few days, my phone became a constant reminder of that conversation. She texted me lists of numbers I didn't ask for. Amounts. Due dates. When I didn't reply fast enough, the messages got sharper. She said things like, "We can't stall the bank forever, and your sister is counting on us." The "we" in those sentences made me want to throw my phone across the room. Part of me waited for an apology. Just one. Any acknowledgement that what she had done to me was wrong. I thought, if she can say she's sorry for the way she treated me, if she can admit, even once, that kicking me out the way she did was cruel, maybe I can help. In some limited way. I don't know it, but maybe I can choose it. Every time we talked, I tried to steer the conversation gently in that direction. Every time, she dodged. At one point, when I brought up the night she told me to leave my key on the counter, she sighed and said, "You were an adult. You would have moved out eventually. Stop acting like I threw you to the wolves." On our second long call about the money, she said the quiet part out loud. She told me my grandparents had sacrificed for me, paid for my school, my clothes, my food, and that I had benefited from all of it. She said, "You think that just disappears? You think you don't owe anything back? We all did what we had to do for you. Now you can do something for us." In her mind, my entire childhood had been a loan, and the interest was due. I asked if she felt any regret about how she had spoken to me growing up. I didn't yell it. I asked it as calmly as I could, the phone pressed so hard to my ear it hurt. There was this little pause. Just long enough for me to hope she might say something real for once. And then she laughed. Not a full laugh. Just that dry sound she makes when she thinks someone is being ridiculous. She said, "I did what I had to do. Life isn't easy. You think I had the luxury of worrying about your feelings." I told her that having a roof and food didn't cancel out being told I ruined her life every time she was in a bad mood. She sighed, and I heard a mug clink against a table, like she was bored already. She said, "You're almost 30. Are you really still stuck on this? I have real problems now. I need money, not a therapy session about your teenage angst." Then she said the thing that really got me. She said, "Do you have any idea what I sacrificed to keep you? People told me to get rid of you, and I didn't. You should be grateful every day you're even alive to complain." She said it like she was listing items on a receipt. Like my whole existence was a bill she never finished paying. I told her that if she wanted credit for not having an abortion, she should take that up with the people who pressured her. Not with me. She went quiet for a second. Then said, "If I was such a monster, why are you even talking to me? Just hang up." But she didn't hang up. Neither did I. We just sat there in this ugly breathing contest, both waiting for the other to blink first, while she stirred whatever was in her mug like she was dealing with a customer service complaint she was tired of hearing. Something inside me snapped in a way I cannot fully describe. All the years I'd spent rehearsing conversations in my head crashed into that one moment. I told her, in a voice that didn't even sound like mine, that I remembered every time she called me a mistake. Every time she used me as a joke. Every time she made sure I knew I was the consequence and not the child. She tried to cut in with, "You're twisting my words," but I talked right over her. I told her about 9th grade, when I came home excited about an award, and she said, "Don't let it go to your head. It doesn't change who you are." I told her about the night she told me to leave my key on the counter, like I was returning something she never ordered. I told her about the way she smiled for church people and went silent the second the front door closed. At one point, she said, "Lower your voice, your sister might hear." And that just made me angrier. I said, maybe she should. Maybe she should know who you really are instead of the performance you put on for everyone else. She said I was being cruel. That no one would ever understand how hard her life had been. That I was ungrateful and dramatic and loved to play the victim. I told her that if telling the truth made me the villain in her story, I could live with that. By the time I finished, my throat hurt. My hand was shaking. And all she could manage was, "You're being cruel. I only called because I needed help." I said, "Exactly. You never call unless you need something." And for the first time in my life, I let the silence after my words sit there instead of rushing to fill it and make her feel better. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. My father was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching me like he'd just seen a car crash. He asked if I was okay. I laughed, in that ugly way that's half sob. I told him I was tired. Tired of being the emergency exit for people who had never once offered me a safe way out of anything. Tired of being the one who was supposed to be understanding and forgiving while everyone else did whatever they wanted. That night, I did something I know is controversial. I opened a blank post on a social media app, stared at the empty box for a long time. Then I started typing, like my hands were trying to outrun my second thoughts. I wrote about being told I ruined her life before I was old enough to spell the word ruin. I wrote about being introduced as the consequence, the lesson, the warning instead of the daughter. I wrote about trophies that got shoved into drawers, birthdays that felt like obligations, and the night I was told to leave my key on the counter so the au pair could have my room. I wrote about sleeping on a sagging couch at my father's place while he shook on the other side of a thin wall, trying to detox without a plan, because it was still less painful than staying where I wasn't wanted. I kept deleting sentences that sounded too dramatic, then retyping them, because the truth sounded dramatic on its own. I didn't use my mother's name or my grandparents' names, but I didn't soften anything. I was done editing myself to protect the people who never protected me. The responses started coming in faster than I expected. At first, it was just a couple of likes from people I barely talked to anymore, and one comment from an old coworker that said, "I had no idea," with a little broken heart icon. Then my cousin shared it and added, "This is our family," like some kind of warning label. And that's when it really took off inside that small circle of people who knew us. A woman who used to sit behind us at the old church wrote a whole paragraph about how she always wondered why I seemed so quiet and tense, and that suddenly a lot of things made sense. One of my mother's friends left a comment that said, "There are always two sides." And I stared at it for a long time before replying, "You were in the room for some of these. You heard her." Which she deleted 20 minutes later. My inbox filled up with private messages from people I hadn't seen in years. Some were pure gossip, asking, "Did she really say that? Did she really kick you out?" Like I was running a subscription drama page. Others were quieter. People saying things like, "My mother never called me a mistake, but she made sure I felt like one." Or, "I thought I was the only one who grew up walking on eggshells." There were a few angry ones, too, from relatives who thought I had crossed some sacred line by naming what everyone already whispered about. One aunt sent me a long message about how I should have handled it privately, how airing dirty laundry only hurt the family, as if the years of mud my mother flung at me behind closed doors had kept us clean up until that point. The weirdest part was seeing my mother respond without responding. She didn't comment on my post, of course. Instead, she made her own vague little status about betrayal and how some people will twist your sacrifices into abuse because they cannot handle the truth. Half her friends rushed to comfort her in the comments, telling her she was a strong woman, that she had done her best, that children could be so cruel. I read every single one, even though I knew I should have muted her years ago. It felt like watching a play I had seen 1,000 times from backstage. Except this time, I had finally stepped out and said, "Actually, here's what it looked like when the curtain was closed." I attached screenshots of a few of my mother's recent texts, her number blurred, but the words clear. The ones where she said I owed her. The ones where she tried to hang my sister's fear around my neck. I stared at that post for a long time. My finger hovered over the button. I thought about my grandparents sitting in their neat living room. About my aunt who always defended my mother. About the cousin who used to call me dramatic whenever I hinted that things at home were not as perfect as people thought. Then I thought about the little version of me who stood in a kitchen with a certificate in her hand and got a shrug instead of pride. I hit share. My phone lit up almost immediately. People commented, messaged, reacted with little icons that felt way too small for what I had just thrown into the world. Old classmates I hadn't talked to in years sent messages saying they always knew something was off in my house, but could never put a finger on it. A woman I barely remembered from church wrote that she had believed my mother when she joked about me being difficult, and now she was ashamed of herself. A few people jumped in to defend my mother without knowing the first thing about our life, saying no parent is perfect and I needed to stop living in the past. And of course, those comments got liked by the exact kind of people I expected. Strangers told their own stories in the replies. About being the scapegoat child, the unwanted one, the kid who got the leftovers of everyone's patience. Reading them felt like being in a crowded room where nobody was pretending everything was fine for once. I kept telling myself I'd close the app and go to bed. And then another notification would pop up, and I'd tap it like I was picking at a scab. Someone shared the post with the caption, "I thought I was alone in this." And that one made my stomach flip. A distant cousin commented a single question mark, then deleted it, which somehow stressed me out more than if he had started a full argument. At one point, I realized it was after midnight and my eyes were burning. My phone battery was down to 10%. And my heart was racing like I had run somewhere when I hadn't moved from the chair. I plugged the phone in across the room so I would have to physically get up to check it, then lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, feeling equal parts exposed and relieved. There was no taking it back anymore. The story was out. I remember staring at the ceiling and thinking, well, you finally said it. Now you have to live with it. My father saw the post later that evening. He sat there with his reading glasses, slowly scrolling, his mouth a thin line. When he looked up, he said, "I'm not going to lie." Seeing all of that written out like that makes my stomach twist. Not because it's wrong, because it's true. He asked if I was sure I wanted to deal with whatever came next. I told him that for most of my life, everyone else had gotten to control the narrative. They got to be the heroes in their own stories, while I played the ungrateful child who never appreciated their sacrifice. For once, I wanted my version out there, too. For about a week, my mother stayed quiet. I know she saw it because people told me she had called them sobbing, saying I had betrayed her. But she didn't call me. That silence felt like standing on a cliff edge, waiting to see if the ground would crumble or hold. Then, 2 weeks later, my phone rang again with a number I didn't know. It was her. She didn't bother pretending everything was fine. She came in hot. She said I had dragged her name through the mud, that people at church were whispering, that neighbors were looking at her differently. She said I had twisted things to make myself look like a victim and her look like a monster. I asked her which parts of what I had written were not true. She paused, then said, "That's not the point. The point is, you didn't have to say it." She told me she regretted ever having me. She had said versions of that before, when I was a kid, always with that half-joking tone. But this time there was nothing playful about it. She said, "I should have walked away when I had the chance. You have done nothing but bring misery into my life." The words landed, but they didn't break me like they would have in the past. I was hurt, but I was also angry and strangely clear. I told her I regretted her too. I told her I would have rather grown up alone than with a mother who made me feel like a punishment. She tried one last time to use my sister as a weapon. She said my sister was being bullied at school now because other kids' parents had seen my post. She said her husband was furious and had moved into the spare room, that he blamed her for involving me. She said they had to move to another city because she couldn't show her face anymore. She blamed all of that on me, like my words had created the behavior, not just exposed it. I told her I didn't control what other people did with the truth. I told her I hoped my sister would one day understand that the mess she was living in existed long before I wrote anything. We ended the call with her saying she never wanted to hear from me again, and me telling her I believed her. She blocked my number. I blocked hers. A month later, after the storm had mostly passed, I quietly deleted the post. Not because I regretted it, but because I felt like I had already gotten what I needed. My story had been told. People had seen the other side. I didn't need to keep the wound open forever. Life went back to its new version of normal. I still went to work. I still came home to the apartment I shared with my father. We still had dinner in front of the television more nights than not. But something in me had shifted. I felt less haunted by the idea that I was supposed to fix everything, prove something, save someone. I stopped checking my phone for messages from people who had never shown up for me in the first place. Sometimes, my sister emails me from an account she set up herself, using the old family computer after everyone is asleep. She tells me about school and friends, and how her mother gets mad if she spends too long in the shower. I answer when I can. I tell her that I love her, even from far away. I don't talk badly about our mother to her. I don't need to. Time will fill in the rest. Last month, she asked if she could call me instead of just emailing. We talked for an hour about nothing important: school, friends, a show she was watching. When we hung up, I realized we sounded like sisters who actually knew each other. And that felt like enough for now. I don't know where this goes, but at least it's going somewhere. Most days, my life would sound boring if I described it to someone who loves chaos. I work. I pay bills. I meet for coffee. I listen to music while I clean. I make grocery lists. I argue with my father about whose turn it is to take the trash out. We laugh about small things. We sit in comfortable silence. Sometimes we talk about the past in a way that feels less like ripping off a bandage and more like comparing scars. He tells me he's proud of me more often now. I'm still learning how to believe him. There are nights when my brain replays everything and asks if I went too far. Did I need to post that story? Could I have handled it more quietly? Maybe. There's a version of this where I never hit share, where I let my mother keep her image while I keep my distance. But that version would have left me carrying all the weight alone. Writing it down, letting other people see it, forced me to admit to myself that it was real. And that it was as bad as it felt. It wasn't a nightmare I had exaggerated. It was my life. I don't have some neat closure to offer. My mother didn't suddenly see the light and come back with apologies. My grandparents didn't reach out with regrets. My sister and I are figuring out our own relationship in the shadows of everything that happened before she was even old enough to remember. My father and I keep moving forward, one ordinary day at a time. I'm not healed, but I'm not drowning either. If there's any point to all of this, it's that sometimes choosing yourself looks ugly from the outside. Sometimes it looks like the wrong person is walking away. People are still free to think I'm the villain in my mother's story. They probably always will. But in my own story, I'm just a woman who finally stopped begging to be loved by someone who never wanted the job and learned to build a life with the imperfect, inconvenient love that actually showed up. Have you ever faced a moment like that? Where you had to choose yourself, even if it meant being seen as the bad guy? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, or if you've experienced anything similar. Let me know in the comments below.